Mr. Wilson was not unconscious. His eyes were closed. His chest rose and fell in shallow, erratic gasps, and his 70-year-old body lay sprawled across the Persian rug like a fallen monument. To anyone watching, he looked like a man having a heart attack. But beneath his stillness, Mr. Wilson was fully aware. His mind was sharp, bitter, and waiting. This was not a medical emergency. This was a test. Mr. Wilson was a billionaire. He had built a tech empire that stretched across 3 continents. He owned the skyline, the algorithms, the future itself. He had everything a man could want, except for one thing: faith in humanity. Over the decades, Mr. Wilson had been betrayed by everyone. His business partners had smiled while embezzling millions. His own children only called when they wanted to discuss inheritance. Even his household staff had stolen from him jewelry, wine, confidential files. He had come to believe a single, crushing truth: every person on earth had a price. Today, he would prove it one final time. The Manhattan penthouse was silent, except for the rain hammering against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Mr. Wilson had set the stage with surgical precision. 10 feet from his collapsed body sat his personal safe, door hanging wide open, revealing stacks of $100 bills that seemed to glow under the recessed lighting. On the glass coffee table, his smartphone lay unlocked, the screen displaying his bank account: $847 million. Mr. Wilson waited. He heard the elevator doors open down the hall. Soft footsteps approached, 2 sets. One belonged to Ruth, his longtime maid. The other belonged to her daughter. Annabella was 13 years old. Mr. Wilson knew this from Ruth's employee file. He knew the girl was obsessed with medicine, that she checked out nursing textbooks from the public library, that she dreamed of becoming a doctor despite having no money for college. He knew that Ruth was 3 months behind on rent, that eviction notices were piling up, that the girl went to bed hungry more nights than not. Today, Ruth had begged permission to bring Annabella to work because the girl's school was closed for repairs. Mr. Wilson had agreed immediately. This was the opportunity he'd been waiting for. "Wait here in the hallway, baby," Ruth whispered, her voice trembling with exhaustion. "I need to check if Mr. Wilson needs anything. Don't come in unless I call you. And whatever you do, don't touch anything. If he wakes up angry, we'll both be on the street tonight. Do you understand?" "Yes, Mama." The girl's voice was small but steady. Mr. Wilson heard Ruth's footsteps retreat toward the kitchen. The girl was alone in the hallway. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then he heard it, the hesitant creak of the study door opening. Annabella had entered the room. Mr. Wilson kept his breathing labored and uneven. He waited for the gasp, the scramble, the moment when the girl would see the fortune laid out before her like a feast. He knew exactly what would happen next. The girl would see the money. She would see the unlocked phone. She would think about her mother's tears, about the eviction notice, about the hunger, and she would reach out and take it. Then he would open his eyes and catch her. Another soul purchased. Another confirmation that the world was exactly as rotten as he believed. But the gasp that came wasn't one of greed. It was one of pure, heart-stopping terror. "Mr. Wilson." Annabella's voice cracked as she rushed toward him, her footsteps frantic against the marble floor. She dropped to her knees beside him, and Mr. Wilson felt small hands pressing against his neck, searching for a pulse. The girl hadn't even glanced at the money. She was trying to save his life. Mr. Wilson hadn't always been a cynic. There was a time, decades ago, when he believed in handshakes and loyalty, when he thought brilliance and hard work would be rewarded with integrity. That was before his first co-founder, Marcus Chun, had sold their proprietary algorithms to a Chinese conglomerate for $30 million. Marcus had looked him in the eye at their weekly strategy meeting and smiled while the contracts were already signed. Before the lawyers could act, Marcus had vanished to Singapore, untouchable and wealthy beyond imagination. The betrayal had carved something out of Mr. Wilson's chest. But he rebuilt. He learned. He stopped trusting partners and built his empire alone, ruthlessly acquiring competitors, patenting everything, sharing nothing. For 15 years, Wilson Technologies dominated the market. He became untouchable. Then came his children. His son, Jeffrey, had seemed genuinely interested in the business until Mr. Wilson discovered the offshore accounts. Jeffrey hadn't stolen money directly. He was too clever for that. He'd been selling insider information to hedge funds, letting them short Wilson Technology stock before quarterly earnings reports. When confronted, Jeffrey hadn't even denied it. He'd simply shrugged and said, "You taught me to see opportunities, Dad." Mr. Wilson had cut him off entirely. His daughter, Victoria, had lasted longer, playing the role of devoted heiress until she tried to have him declared mentally incompetent to seize control of the company. The court battle had been vicious and public. She lost, but the damage was done. Mr. Wilson learned that even blood had a price. The servants were no different. His head of security had sold access codes to his penthouse to tabloid photographers. His personal chef had written a tell-all memoir filled with lies. His previous maid, a woman named Elena who had worked for him for 7 years, had systematically stolen over $200,000 worth of art, replacing originals with perfect forgeries. He'd only discovered the theft during a routine insurance appraisal. Each betrayal had added another layer of armor, another lock on the door, another camera in the ceiling. Mr. Wilson had turned his penthouse into a fortress and his heart into stone. He began documenting his theory that human morality was simply a function of opportunity cost. Everyone was honest until the price was right. He'd even hired psychologists to help him design tests, planning to publish his findings in a book titled The Price of Souls. But he needed one final piece of evidence. He needed to prove that even innocence was an illusion, that even a child, especially a poor child with every reason to be desperate, would choose survival over integrity when the stakes were high enough. That's when he thought of Ruth's daughter. Ruth had worked for him for 8 years, quiet and efficient, never asking for anything beyond her modest salary. She was exactly the kind of person who would raise a child to be good. But Mr. Wilson knew better. Goodness was a luxury. Annabella would see that open safe and understand what it meant. Escape from poverty, security for a mother, a future that wasn't defined by hunger and struggle. Before we dive right in, quickly hit that subscribe button right now and join the Storyverse community. Whether you're watching from the skyscrapers of USA, the heart of London, UK, or anywhere across Australia, Canada, and Europe, drop a comment below. I want to see just how far this story of greed and humanity can reach. Now, let's dive right back into the scene. She would take the money. They always did. And when she did, Mr. Wilson would finally have his proof that the world was exactly as dark as it seemed through his eyes. The Iron Emperor would win his final victory, not through conquest or innovation, but through the confirmation that he had been right all along to trust no one. He had been so certain, until Annabella's hands pressed against his throat, searching desperately for his pulse, and her voice broke the silence with words he never expected to hear. "Please don't die. Please, please don't die." Annabella James had discovered medicine the way some children discover fairy tales. She'd been 9 years old, sitting in the emergency room waiting area while her mother worked a double shift cleaning hospital floors. A nurse had left a copy of Basic Emergency Care on the chair beside her. Annabella had opened it expecting boredom and found magic instead. The human body was a puzzle, and every page offered clues to solving it. She'd started visiting the public library every day after school, systematically working through the medical section. The librarian, Mrs. Chun, had learned to hold books for her: Gray's Anatomy for Students, Emergency Medical Responder, Fundamentals of Nursing. Annabella couldn't afford to buy them, but she could memorize them. She filled composition notebooks with diagrams of the circulatory system, steps for CPR, symptoms of cardiac arrest. While other 13-year-olds posted on social media, Annabella studied ventricular fibrillation. Ruth had tried to encourage different dreams. "Baby, doctors need money for college. Lots of money. Maybe you could be a nurse instead, or a medical assistant." But she'd said it gently, heartbroken by the hope in her daughter's eyes. Ruth knew what Annabella didn't yet understand, that their world didn't make room for poor black girls to become surgeons. Their world made room for them to clean surgeons' offices. They lived in a one-bedroom apartment in the Bronx with walls so thin they could hear their neighbor's television through the plaster. Ruth slept on the couch and gave Annabella the bedroom, though the girl had tried to refuse. The eviction notice had arrived 3 weeks ago, bright orange and impossible to ignore. Ruth had hidden it under the mattress, but Annabella had found it while looking for her mother's heating pad. She'd said nothing, but that night Ruth had found her daughter crying silently in the bathroom, the notice clutched in her small hands. The next morning, Ruth had begged Mr. Wilson's housekeeper for extra hours. Any hours. Mrs. Higgins had reluctantly agreed to let Ruth bring Annabella on Saturdays when the staff was reduced. But the girl stays invisible. Mrs. Higgins had warned. Mr. Wilson hates children. He says they're manipulative little creatures who pretend to be innocent. If he sees her, you're both finished. Annabella had promised to be invisible. She brought her library book, Emergency Medical Techniques, planning to study in whatever corner her mother pointed to. She had no intention of being noticed. She had no intention of finding Mr. Wilson collapsed on the study floor, his face gray and his breathing labored, surrounded by more money than she'd ever seen in her life. Mr. Wilson hadn't always been a cynic. There was a time, decades ago, when he believed in handshakes and loyalty, when he thought brilliance and hard work would be rewarded with integrity. That was before his first co-founder, Marcus Chun, had sold their proprietary algorithms to a Chinese conglomerate for $30 million. Marcus had looked him in the eye at their weekly strategy meeting and smiled while the contracts were already signed. Before the lawyers could act, Marcus had vanished to Singapore, untouchable and wealthy beyond imagination. The betrayal had carved something out of Mr. Wilson's chest. But he rebuilt. He learned. He stopped trusting partners and built his empire alone, ruthlessly acquiring competitors, patenting everything, sharing nothing. For 15 years, Wilson Technologies dominated the market. He became untouchable. Then came his children. His son, Jeffrey, had seemed genuinely interested in the business until Mr. Wilson discovered the offshore accounts. Jeffrey hadn't stolen money directly. He was too clever for that. He'd been selling insider information to hedge funds, letting them short Wilson Technology stock before quarterly earnings reports. When confronted, Jeffrey hadn't even denied it. He'd simply shrugged and said, "You taught me to see opportunities, Dad." Mr. Wilson had cut him off entirely. His daughter, Victoria, had lasted longer, playing the role of devoted heiress until she tried to have him declared mentally incompetent to seize control of the company. The court battle had been vicious and public. She lost, but the damage was done. Mr. Wilson learned that even blood had a price. The servants were no different. His head of security had sold access codes to his penthouse to tabloid photographers. His personal chef had written a tell-all memoir filled with lies. His previous maid, a woman named Elena who had worked for him for 7 years, had systematically stolen over $200,000 worth of art, replacing originals with perfect forgeries. He'd only discovered the theft during a routine insurance appraisal. Each betrayal had added another layer of armor, another lock on the door, another camera in the ceiling. Mr. Wilson had turned his penthouse into a fortress and his heart into stone. He began documenting his theory that human morality was simply a function of opportunity cost. Everyone was honest until the price was right. He'd even hired psychologists to help him design tests, planning to publish his findings in a book titled The Price of Souls. But he needed one final piece of evidence. He needed to prove that even innocence was an illusion, that even a child, especially a poor child with every reason to be desperate, would choose survival over integrity when the stakes were high enough. That's when he thought of Ruth's daughter. Ruth had worked for him for 8 years, quiet and efficient, never asking for anything beyond her modest salary. She was exactly the kind of person who would raise a child to be good. But Mr. Wilson knew better. Goodness was a luxury. Annabella would see that open safe and understand what it meant. Escape from poverty, security for her mother, a future that wasn't defined by hunger and struggle. She would take the money. They always did. And when she did, Mr. Wilson would finally have his proof that the world was exactly as dark as it seemed through his eyes. The Iron Emperor would win his final victory, not through conquest or innovation, but through the confirmation that he had been right all along to trust no one. He had been so certain, until Annabella's hands pressed against his throat, searching desperately for his pulse, and her voice broke the silence with words he never expected to hear. "Please don't die. Please, please don't die." Annabella James had discovered medicine the way some children discover fairy tales. She'd been 9 years old, sitting in the emergency room waiting area while her mother worked a double shift cleaning hospital floors. A nurse had left a copy of Basic Emergency Care on the chair beside her. Annabella had opened it expecting boredom and found magic instead. The human body was a puzzle, and every page offered clues to solving it. She'd started visiting the public library every day after school, systematically working through the medical section. The librarian, Mrs. Chun, had learned to hold books for her: Gray's Anatomy for Students, Emergency Medical Responder, Fundamentals of Nursing. Annabella couldn't afford to buy them, but she could memorize them. She filled composition notebooks with diagrams of the circulatory system, steps for CPR, symptoms of cardiac arrest. While other 13-year-olds posted on social media, Annabella studied ventricular fibrillation. Ruth had tried to encourage different dreams. "Baby, doctors need money for college. Lots of money. Maybe you could be a nurse instead, or a medical assistant." But she'd said it gently, heartbroken by the hope in her daughter's eyes. Ruth knew what Annabella didn't yet understand, that their world didn't make room for poor black girls to become surgeons. Their world made room for them to clean surgeons' offices. They lived in a one-bedroom apartment in the Bronx with walls so thin they could hear their neighbor's television through the plaster. Ruth slept on the couch and gave Annabella the bedroom, though the girl had tried to refuse. The eviction notice had arrived 3 weeks ago, bright orange and impossible to ignore. Ruth had hidden it under the mattress, but Annabella had found it while looking for her mother's heating pad. She'd said nothing, but that night Ruth had found her daughter crying silently in the bathroom, the notice clutched in her small hands. The next morning, Ruth had begged Mr. Wilson's housekeeper for extra hours. Any hours? Mrs. Higgins had reluctantly agreed to let Ruth bring Annabella on Saturdays when the staff was reduced. But the girl stays invisible, Mrs. Higgins had warned. Mr. Wilson hates children. He says they're manipulative little creatures who pretend to be innocent. If he sees her, you're both finished. Annabella had promised to be invisible. She brought her library book, Emergency Medical Techniques, planning to study in whatever corner her mother pointed to. She had no intention of being noticed. She had no intention of finding Mr. Wilson collapsed on a study floor, his face gray and his breathing labored, surrounded by more money than she'd seen in her life. Mr. Wilson had spent 3 days perfecting the setup. Every detail mattered. This wasn't just a test. It was theater, and he was both director and lead actor. He'd started with the safe. Normally, it sat hidden behind a sliding panel in the mahogany bookshelf, invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. On Thursday morning, he'd pulled it into full view, positioning it exactly 10 feet from where he planned to collapse. He'd filled it with cash, stacks of $100 bills still wrapped in bank bands, $50,000 in total. He'd arranged the bills so they caught the light, so they practically glowed with possibility. He'd left the door hanging open at a 45-degree angle, as if he'd been interrupted mid-transaction. The phone had required more thought. He'd disabled the auto-lock feature and opened his banking app, letting it sit on the account summary page. $847 million. He'd positioned the phone on the glass coffee table, screen up, brightness at maximum. Anyone entering the room would see it immediately. The temptation would be overwhelming. Not just cash you could touch, but digital wealth you could transfer with a few taps. He'd placed 3 microscopic cameras around the room, one hidden in the antique clock on the mantel, another embedded in the spine of a leather-bound book on the shelf, the third tucked into the frame of an oil painting. Every angle covered. He wanted to capture the exact moment when innocence died and greed took over. The footage would be the centerpiece of his book. On Friday, he'd rehearsed his collapse. He'd practiced falling in a way that looked natural, but positioned his body perfectly, close enough to the money to make the temptation unbearable, far enough away to make death seem safe. He'd worked on his breathing, making it shallow and irregular, the kind of breathing that signaled a man on the edge of death. He'd even researched the symptoms of cardiac arrest to make sure his performance was medically convincing. Saturday morning, He'd sent Mrs. Higgins and the rest of the staff home early, claiming he wanted privacy to work on business documents. He'd made sure Ruth knew she'd be working alone, that she could bring her daughter if needed. He'd baited the trap carefully. Now, lying on the Persian rug with his eyes closed and his breathing ragged, Mr. Wilson waited. He heard Annabella enter the room. He heard her sharp intake of breath. This was it, the moment of truth. Soon he would have his proof, captured in high definition from 3 angles, that even a child with dreams of healing would choose money over morality when the price was right. He waited for the sound of rustling bills. Instead, he felt small hands on his neck and heard a girl's voice breaking with terror. Annabella's fingers trembled as she pressed them against Mr. Wilson's carotid artery. She'd read about this exact moment in Chapter 7 of Emergency Medical Responder. Find the pulse. 2 fingers, gentle pressure, count the beats. But the book hadn't prepared her for the reality of it. The clammy coolness of his skin, the way his head lolled to the side, the gray pallor that made him look already dead. Her mind screamed at her to run, to get her mother to call 911. But she'd also read the statistics. Brain damage began after 4 minutes without oxygen. Permanent damage after 6. Death after 10. Every second she wasted deciding was a second Mr. Wilson didn't have. She could see the money. God, she could see it. The safe sat there like an open wound, bleeding $100 bills. Even from where she knelt, she could read the numbers on some of them. She could see the phone, too. Its screen glowed with numbers so large they didn't seem real. $847 million. The solution to every problem her mother had ever cried about, sitting right there, unguarded and available. The eviction notice flashed through her mind. Her mother's face when she'd found Annabella crying in the bathroom. The way Ruth's hands shook lately from exhaustion, from working 3 jobs that still weren't enough. Annabella could fix all of it. She could take just 1 stack, just 1, and Mr. Wilson would never even notice it was gone. But then his chest hitched, a terrible rattling sound that yanked her attention back to his face. His lips were turning blue. The money disappeared from her mind as if it had never existed. There was only the checklist from her library books, the steps she'd memorized and recited until they became prayer. Assess breathing. Check for obstruction. Position the airway. Begin compressions if needed. She tilted his head back gently, the way the diagrams had shown, opening his airway. She leaned close to his mouth, listening for breath sounds. Shallow but present. Breathing but not well. Not a full cardiac arrest yet, but close. So close. Mr. Wilson, she said, her voice cracking. Can you hear me? Squeeze my hand if you can hear me. Nothing. His hand remained limp in hers. She made her decision in the space of a heartbeat. She needed help, professional help, someone who knew more than what library books could teach a 13-year-old girl. But there was no time to find her mother, no time to run downstairs and flag down a doorman, no time to do anything except act. Annabella's hands moved to Mr. Wilson's wrist, checking for a radial pulse. Weak, thready, present but barely. His breathing was shallow and irregular, each breath a struggle. She pressed her palm against his forehead, cold and clammy. All the signs pointed to shock, possibly cardiac distress. He needed a hospital. He needed it now. Her eyes darted to the phone on the coffee table, the unlocked phone displaying $847 million. She lunged for it, her fingers closing around the device with desperate urgency. From beneath his closed eyelids, Mr. Wilson felt a surge of bitter triumph. There it was, the moment he'd been waiting for. The girl had gone for phone. Of course she had. They always did. He'd given her every reason to be noble, a life to save, a clear emergency, and still, greed had won. She would open his banking app, transfer her funds, maybe take a screenshot of his account numbers. The cameras were recording every second. He'd been right all along. But then Annabella's voice cut through his thoughts, sharp with panic. Emergency services? I need an ambulance at the Wilson penthouse for 32 Park Avenue, 87th floor. It's Mr. Wilson. He's collapsed. Breathing is shallow. Pulse is weak. Skin is cold and gray. I think it's his heart. Mr. Wilson's internal narrative stuttered to a halt. She wasn't stealing. She was calling for help. "I'm 13, Annabella was saying, her voice trembling but clear. "I'm not a doctor, but I've studied emergency response. No, I haven't moved him. His airway is open. Pulse is about 40 beats per minute. Please hurry." She ended the call and immediately began scrolling through the phone's contacts. Mr. Wilson felt her fingers brush his collar, loosening his tie to help his breathing. She was murmuring to him now, her voice soft and scared. "Help is coming, Mr. Wilson. You're going to be okay. Just hold on. Please hold on." She found what she was looking for in his contacts. Dr. Collins, cardiologist. She pressed dial without hesitation. "Dr. Collins? I'm calling from Mr. Wilson's phone. He's collapsed. I've called 911, but I thought you should know. His breathing is labored, pulse is weak. Skin presentation suggests possible cardiac event." The doctor's voice crackled through the speaker, urgent and professional. "Who is this? Where's Wilson?" "I'm Annabella. I work here with my mother. Mr. Wilson is on the floor. I don't know what to do. Should I start CPR? Is he breathing?" "Yes, but barely." "Then monitor him. Keep his airway clear. Don't start compressions unless he stops breathing completely. I'm 10 minutes away." Annabella set the phone down carefully, then did something that made Mr. Wilson's carefully constructed cynicism crack straight down the middle. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small roll of medical tape, the kind nursing students use for practice. With trembling fingers, she tore off a piece and gently placed it over the phone's front camera, covering the lens completely. "No one should see you like this, Mr. Wilson," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You deserve your privacy." Then she took off her cardigan and draped it over his chest like a blanket, tucking it around his shoulders with the careful tenderness of someone who'd spent her whole life taking care of people. She'd ignored a fortune to protect his dignity. The minutes crawled by like hours. Annabella knelt beside Mr. Wilson, her hand resting lightly on his chest to monitor each shallow breath. She'd positioned herself so she could watch both his face and the rise and fall of his rib cage, the way her library books had instructed. Every few seconds, she checked his pulse again, counting the beats against the second hand of the ornate clock on the mantel. "You're doing good, Mr. Wilson," she whispered, her voice trembling but steady. "Your heart is still beating. That's good. That's really good. Help is coming. Dr. Collins is on his way, and the ambulance will be here soon." She'd read somewhere that unconscious patients could sometimes hear voices, that the sound of someone talking could anchor them to consciousness, keep them from slipping too far into the dark. She didn't know if it was true, but she couldn't bear the silence. "I'm going to stay right here with you," she continued, adjusting the cardigan over his chest. "I'm not going anywhere. You're not alone." His breathing hitched, becoming more labored. Annabella's heart hammered against her ribs. She leaned closer, tilting his head back slightly to keep his airway open. His lips were still tinged with blue, but he was breathing. As long as he was breathing, there was hope. "My name is Annabella," she said, tears starting to blur her vision. "I'm Ruth's daughter. You probably don't know me. My mom cleans your kitchen and does your laundry. She talks about you sometimes. She says you're brilliant but lonely. She worries about you." She checked his pulse again. Still there. Still weak, but there. "I want to be a doctor someday," she continued, the words tumbling out in a nervous stream. "I know that probably sounds stupid. Poor kids from the Bronx don't become doctors, right? But I can't help it. I love medicine. I love understanding how the body works, how everything connects. The heart, the lungs, the brain. It's all so beautiful and complicated." Mr. Wilson's chest rose and fell, in and out, each breath a small victory. "I've been studying emergency response," Annabella said. "I memorized the protocols for cardiac events, strokes, respiratory failure. I never thought I'd actually need them. I never thought I'd be kneeling next to someone like you, someone so important. Try to remember everything I learned from library books." She heard sirens in the distance, growing closer. Relief flooded through her so powerfully she nearly sobbed. "Hear that, Mr. Wilson? That's the ambulance. They're coming for you. You just have to hold on a little longer. Please hold on. She squeezed his hand gently, and for just a moment, so brief she almost thought she'd imagine it, she felt his fingers twitch against hers. That's it, she whispered. Stay with me. Stay here. Don't leave. The ambulance arrived with a controlled chaos that filled the penthouse with urgent voices and a squeak of equipment wheels on marble. Paramedics swept into the study with practiced efficiency, and Annabella scrambled backward to give him room, her cardigan falling from Mr. Wilson's chest onto the floor. 13-year-old female found the patient collapsed. One paramedic said into his radio while his partner began taking vitals. Patient is a 70-year-old male, shallow respiration, weak pulse, possible cardiac event. I called Dr. Collins, Annabella said quickly, her voice small amid the professional activity. His cardiologist. He said he's 10 minutes away. The lead paramedic glanced at her with surprise and something that might have been respect. Good thinking. What's his pulse rate? Around 40 beats per minute when I last checked. It was thready but consistent. They worked quickly, attaching monitors, preparing to move him. Annabella stood pressed against the bookshelf, watching, her hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles ached. It was only when one of the paramedics shifted position that she saw it again. The phone, still lying on the coffee table, still unlocked, still displaying that impossible number. Her breath caught. In an emergency. She'd forgotten about it. She'd use it to call for help and then set it down, and now it sat there exposed. Anyone could see it. The paramedics, the building staff who would inevitably appear, the police if they came. Mr. Wilson's entire financial life was on display. She moved before she could overthink it. While the paramedics focused on stabilizing Mr. Wilson for transport, Annabella slipped around them and picked up the phone. The screen was still bright, still showing the banking app with all those zeros. She could look. God, she could look. She could memorize the account number, write down the routing information. Even if she didn't take anything now, she could have the information for later, for when her mother needed it most, for when the eviction became real. Her thumb hovered over the screen. Then she pressed the lock button, and the screen went dark. She couldn't do it. Even now, even with Mr. Wilson unconscious and surrounded by paramedics, even with no one watching, she couldn't bring herself to violate his privacy. It felt wrong in a way that went deeper than law or morality. It felt like a betrayal of the trust he'd placed in the world by leaving his phone unlocked, even if he'd never meant to. Miss, one of the paramedics was looking at her. We need to take him now. Are you family? No, my mother works here. I just found him. You did good, kid. Real good. You probably saved his life. They wheeled Mr. Wilson toward the elevator on a collapsible gurney, his face now covered with an oxygen mask, monitors beeping steadily. Annabella watched them go, still holding his phone in her shaking hands. She looked down at the dark screen, at her own reflection staring back at her. Then she walked to Mr. Wilson's desk and placed the phone carefully in the top drawer, closing it gently. Some things weren't hers to see. Some things weren't for sale. Not even when the price was everything she needed. Dr. Collins arrived at the hospital 20 minutes after the ambulance. He found Mr. Wilson in a private room, awake and furious, with Annabella sitting in a chair outside the door next to her mother. Ruth had her arm around her daughter, both of them looking exhausted and shaken. You can go in now, a nurse told them. He's asking for you. Annabella's stomach dropped. Of course he was asking for them. He probably wanted to fire Ruth, to accuse Annabella of something, to punish them for the intrusion into his private world. She'd touched his things, used his phone, seen his home in a moment of vulnerability. Men like Mr. Wilson didn't forgive that. Ruth squeezed her hand. It's okay, baby. We'll face this together. They entered the room to find Mr. Wilson sitting upright in the hospital bed, looking far healthier than someone who'd been near death an hour ago. His color had returned, his breathing was normal, and his eyes were sharp and alert. Too alert for someone who'd just survived a cardiac event. Close the door, he said, his voice cold. Ruth did, her hand trembling on the handle. Mr. Wilson looked at Annabella with an expression she couldn't read. I wasn't sick, he said flatly. It was a test. I faked the collapse. The open safe, the unlocked phone. It was all deliberate. I wanted to see what you would do. The words hit Annabella like a physical blow. She felt her mother's hand tighten on her shoulder, heard Ruth's sharp intake of breath. A test. It had all been a test. I had cameras recording everything, Mr. Wilson continued, his voice hard. I've spent months designing this experiment. I needed to prove that everyone, even children, even supposedly innocent, would steal if given the opportunity. I was writing a book about it. The Price of Souls. You were supposed to be my final proof. Annabella stared at him, her mind struggling to process what he was saying. He'd been awake the whole time. He'd felt her checking his pulse, heard her frightened voice calling for help, listened to her talking to him to keep his spirit anchored, and it had all been fake. You were testing me, she whispered. Yes. You wanted me to steal from you. I expected you to steal from me, he corrected. Everyone does. Eventually. I thought you would be no different. Something broke inside Annabella. All the fear, all the adrenaline, all the desperate hope that she'd save his life. It had all been for nothing. She'd been a rat in a maze, a subject in a cruel experiment. Tears spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them. I thought you were dying, she said, her voice cracking. I was so scared. I thought if I didn't do everything right, you would die, and it would be my fault. Annabella, Ruth started, but Mr. Wilson held up his hand. He was staring at Annabella with an expression that had shifted from cold accusation to something else entirely. Something that looked almost like shame. You cover my phone's camera, he said quietly. Why? Because... Annabella wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Because you look so helpless. And I thought if you woke up and found out people had seen you like that, you'd be embarrassed. Nobody should have their worst moment recorded. The money didn't tempt you at all? Of course it tempted me. The words burst out of her, raw and honest. We're being evicted. My mom works 3 jobs, and it's still not enough. I see that much money, and I think about everything it could fix, everything could change. But you needed help. You needed a doctor. That was more important than money. Mr. Wilson's face had gone pale again, but this time it wasn't from illness. It was from the dawning realization of what he'd done. I'm so sorry, Mr. Wilson, Annabella continued through her tears. I'm sorry I touched your phone without permission. I'm sorry I called your doctor. I'm sorry I wasn't invisible like I promised Mama I'd be. Please don't fire her. This was all my fault. We'll leave right now. She turned toward the door, but Mr. Wilson's voice stopped her. Wait. She looked back at him. The coldness was gone from his face, replaced by something that looked painfully like regret. When he spoke again, his voice was rough. You were supposed to prove me right about the world, he said. Instead, you proved me wrong about everything. 5 years later, the auditorium of Harvard Medical School buzzed with excitement and the rustle of graduation gowns. Families filled the seats, cameras ready, voices echoing off the vaulted ceiling. Somewhere in the back, a baby cried. Somewhere close to the front, someone popped a champagne cork prematurely and got shushed by an usher. Annabella James sat in the 3rd row with her fellow graduates, her hands folded carefully in her lap to keep them from shaking. The red and gold honor cords draped around her neck felt impossibly heavy, though they weighed almost nothing. Summa cum laude, top of her class. Full scholarship from the Wilson Foundation for Medical Excellence. She still couldn't quite believe it was real. Annabella James. The dean's voice rang out across the auditorium. She stood, her legs unsteady, and walked toward the stage. The applause swelled around her, but she barely heard it. Her eyes were scanning the front row, searching. There, front row, aisle seat. Mr. Wilson sat with his hands clasped on top of his cane, his face weathered but his eyes bright. Next to him sat Ruth, wearing a new dress that Annabella had bought her with money from her summer research position. Her mother was crying, not even trying to hide it, her hands pressed to her mouth. Annabella climbed the steps to the stage and accepted her diploma from the dean. The weight of it in her hands felt like vindication, like proof that the girl who'd knelt on a Billionaire's floor 5 years ago hadn't been foolish to dream. As she turned to leave the stage, Mr. Wilson stood. It took him effort. He'd aged in these 5 years, groaned Frylier, but he stood and applauded, and the rest of the front row stood with him. Then the second row. Then the entire auditorium was on its feet, though most of them didn't know why. Didn't know the story of how a 13-year-old girl had saved a bitter old man's soul with nothing but compassion and medical tape. The reception afterward was chaos. Ruth couldn't stop hugging her, couldn't stop crying, kept saying, my baby, my brilliant baby into Annabella's shoulder. Classmates congratulated her. Professors shook her hand. Someone thrust a glass of champagne into her palm. But eventually, the crowd thinned enough that Annabella could make her way to where Mr. Wilson sat in a quiet corner, his cane resting against his knee. Congratulations, Dr. James, he said, and the title made her throat tight. I'm not a doctor yet, she said, sitting beside him. Not until I finish my residency. Close enough. He smiled, and it transformed his face into something warm. It had taken him years to learn how to smile like that, to let the armor down. Your mother tells me you've been accepted to 3 different residency programs. All excellent. I'm leaning toward Columbia, the pediatric cardiology program. Following my footsteps? He tapped his chest where his pacemaker sat beneath his shirt, installed 2 years ago when his heart had finally decided to give him a real scare. Someone has to keep an eye on you. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the celebration continue around them. Finally, Mr. Wilson spoke again. I never published that book, he said. The one about the price of souls. I know. I burned all my research. The footage, the notes, everything. I know that too. Do you know why? Annabella looked at him. At this man who tried so hard to prove the world was rotten and had instead discovered it could be beautiful. Because I proved you wrong. Because you proved me wrong, he agreed. I'd spent 70 years building walls, and you tore them down in 10 minutes with nothing but kindness. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. I have something for you. Mr. Wilson, you've already given me so much. It's not a gift. It's a job offer. He handed her the envelope. The Wilson Foundation is expanding. We're building a new medical research wing focused on pediatric cardiology. I want you to be its director when you finish your residency. Annabella stared at the envelope, unable to speak. You'll have full autonomy, he continued. Your own team, unlimited research budget, access to the best equipment in the world. All I ask is that you do what you did for me that day. Save lives, even when it would be easier not to, especially when it would be easier not to. I don't know what to say. Say yes. Say you'll take everything I built through greed and cynicism and use it to prove that kindness is stronger. Say you'll be the legacy I should have created 30 years ago. Annabella opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a formal offer letter, printed on Wilson Foundation letterhead. But there was something else, too, a photograph, old and faded. It showed a young Mr. Wilson, maybe 30 years old, standing with a woman and 2 small children. His family, before the betrayals, before the armor. He was smiling in the photo, genuinely smiling the way he smiled now. I found that last month, he said quietly. I'd forgotten I could look like that. Forgotten I'd ever been that person. You reminded me. Annabella looked up at him. This man who tried to buy proof of humanity's darkness and had instead discovered its light. I'll take the job, she said, on one condition. Name it. You have to promise to be there for the ribbon cutting. Front row, just like today. Mr. Wilson's eyes grew bright. He held out his hand, and Annabella shook it. Deal, he said, though you'll have to forgive me if I don't stand for the entire ceremony. These old bones aren't what they used to be. You can sit, Annabella said, squeezing his hand, as long as you're there. Ruth appeared beside them, her face still streaked with happy tears. They're asking for photos, she said. Family photos. Well, Mr. Wilson looked between them. Shall we? And so they did. Ruth, Annabella, and the man who'd stopped being a bitter billionaire the day a 13-year-old girl chose his life over his fortune. The photographer positioned them in front of a Harvard banner, and right before the flash went off, Mr. Wilson put his arms around both of them. Say cheese, the photographer called. But they were already smiling, This family that greed had tried to tear apart and grace had bound together. The camera captured it perfectly. The moment when a test designed to prove humanity's darkness instead illuminated its brightest light. Years later, when Annabella James became the youngest director of medical research in Wilson Foundation history, that photograph would sit on her desk in a silver frame. And every time she looked at it, she would remember the most important lesson she'd ever learned. Some things aren't for sale. Not dignity. Not compassion. Not the choice to save a life when a fortune sits beside it, waiting. The world might have its price, but the human soul, the real one, the one worth saving, was absolutely priceless. If this story of compassion inspired you, don't let it end here. Subscribe now to ensure you never miss another moment where kindness proves stronger than cynicism and humanity triumphs over greed. Share Annabella's story with someone who needs to remember that integrity matters, that character is priceless, and that one act of selflessness can change everything. Sometimes, all it takes is one girl's choice and a billionaire's awakening to prove that the world isn't as dark as it seems. What will you choose when your moment comes? Subscribe. Share. See you in the next video.